let's go into woodlands now. Okay. A lot of times what we see today and what we sort of, advocate for, fight for as conservationists is scenes that look like this in the bottom left, right? Think about a lot of public lands. I mean, just think about a lot of land, period. Next time you drive around the landscape of Tennessee, going anywhere, whether you're in Nashville, driving through West Nashville, looking up at the hills, notice how much a lot of those landscapes look just like this. When you drive through outskirts of Clarksville, a lot of it looks like this. Drive through Fall Creek Falls State Park. Drive through a variety of state parks or wildlife management areas or national parks or national forests. They all look, many of them look very similar to this. They're so dense. Now, some of that density is appropriate and is natural, but much of this density is highly inappropriate and highly artifactual as a result of landscape change. So we know from a variety of evidence that many of our woodlands, and let's go ahead and take the time to kind of introduce what a woodland is as opposed to forest, that many of our woodlands have changed from their original condition. So let's define woodland. Woodlands tend to be tree dominated, but they also have a grassland-like floor, or at least an open ground floor. They often have 2 layers. They may have 3. So in addition to a tree canopy, you often will have that tree canopy is open enough so you get a lot of light penetrating through to the ground level so that you could have a fairly continuous or at least somewhat dense patch of grasses and grass-like plants growing on the ground floor. You may have in certain types of woodlands also some scattered shrubs and small trees that sort of form like an intermediate layer, kind of like a shrub layer. Over time, though, because woodlands tend to be driven especially by fire, but that's not the only factor. When you take fire away or when you take grazing away, those specific kinds of woodlands can grow up and become forest-like. They can have a very dense understory layer. And what happens is as they get shadier and shadier, too much sunlight begins to suppress the growth of grasses and wildflowers on the ground. And then all those trees begin dropping leaves, right? And so you get a duff of leaf litter that builds up and forms an artificial blanket across the surface. You can see that leaf litter blanket. As you begin to build up an artificially thick leaf litter layer that no longer burns off because we don't have fires burning the landscape anymore, then that allows for trees that are shade adapted, like beech trees and maple trees, to start seeding into that thick leaf litter layer. And so now the stage has been set for what was an open sunny woodland over just the course of a few decades can transition into a rapidly developing and closing artificial forest. So take, for example, this scene, which is just east of Birmingham, Alabama. This is Alabama's highest point called Mount Chiaha. Chiaha Mountain, as you look at it today from the summit of the mountain looking down to the south, appears as a very dense forest that goes all the way from the bottom up onto the slopes and up onto the top. But if you were to walk into these slope forests, you would see all the signatures, and this is what I'm going to teach you in this hour, of indicators to suggest that it's artificially closed, that it's way too dense, and that in fact, it should be much more open, probably somewhere between 30 and 50% more open. Now, that does not necessarily mean we need to come in and clear cut the slopes, but it might mean that we need to come in and very selectively take out a bunch of trees, take out the wrong trees, focus on the right trees so that we can enhance the health and vigor of the entire ecosystem. Let's take a look at some historical quotes from Southwest Arkansas that sort of describe what we mean by woodlands changing over time. This is just outside of Hot Springs, Arkansas, described by George Engelman, who was a botanist, who was based out of the Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis. He says, The region is a massive, high, uniform sandstone mountain chain, overgrown with rather small pines, stunted oaks, and a few nut trees. He's meaning probably hickories, especially. Grass and flowers cover the gravelly soil. So those three trees, oaks, pines, and hickories, and the fact that grasses and flowers cover the gravelly soil tells you a lot about this. Number one, it tells you there's just a few dominant tree species. That's one of the characteristics of woodlands. They don't have highly diverse tree canopies like true forests do. Oaks, pines, and hickory trees are fire-adapted species for the most part. So the fact that they're abundant leans toward it being more of a woodland system. And the fact that there's a lot of grass and wildflowers is important. That tells you there has to be enough light to really promote those kinds of plants in the ground layer. The fact that there's grass especially is the indicator that there's a lot of light reaching the ground. And then gravelly soil. That tells you something about the soil fertility or lack thereof. If it's gravelly, that means there's an additional component that's related to the underlying geology and soils that's helping to promote this as a non-forested ecosystem and more of a type of woodland. What do we call that when the geology and soils is the primary factor or is a factor? What do we call that type of factor? Edaphic. Good. Remember that term? E-D-A-P-H-I-C. Edaphic factors are those related to the underlying soil and geology. Good job, Matthew.
I had a question.
Hey, what's up?
Hey, those gravelly soils, I'm forever going back to the plate tectonics part, right?
Yeah.
So what formed those gravelly soils there?
Yeah, well,
But
yeah, and you don't probably have to go back quite to plate tectonic days necessarily, but in a lot of places with gravelly soils, like in West Tennessee, those gravels are due to the fact that they were laid down along the edge of a coastline, right? But you can also get gravel in other cases based on the normal wear and tear and normal breakdown of bedrock. So sandstone and limestone and chert, under the right conditions, can break apart and become gravelly at the surface. So it depends on the kind of gravel and where it is on the landscape, but those are a couple of ways that gravel can kind of form. Okay. All right.
thank you very much, Dwayne.
You're welcome. So now let's go 50 years later and let's take a look at what this resident Andrew McBride says about the area. The forest was largely virgin, meaning sort of untouched in his perspective. Huge trees that sheltered woods grass. Again, indicating that the woods were open, there were big trees, but that the floor of the ground was grassy. All back up next to the mountains was open, big timber with no underbrush. That's just the natural way it was. It was clear underneath the trees. Now, let's stop and address one common myth with respect to ecosystems. He's describing the land that as it was in the early days of settlers moving into this part of the country, which is Western Arkansas. His perception that the land was in virgin condition is really a biased view. What is missing from this story? Virgin seems to imply without any influence from man or people. But what's missing from this particular part of early Arkansas that maybe this person, Andrew McBride, maybe is not giving us the full picture? Native American land management, which had been happening for at least 10,000 years. And so if he's saying, oh, this was, a virgin landscape, but it's also at the same time discounting the very real and important role that Native American tribes have been having in this area. And guess what? Wildlife and species of most all kinds had been flourishing under Native American management. And Native American traditional ecological knowledge for all of the Holocene and into the end of the Pleistocene. But it took 2 centuries or less for all that to come crashing down without Native American management, under Euro-American management. And so all of the changes that we've begun to see, many of which have been bad, many of which have been disastrous for our ecosystems, have largely come in the last 200 years, 250 years, depending on what part of the South you're in. In some cases, in the past 400 years, the farther east you go, and the farther southeast you go. But we should not necessarily, this is a good example of looking at things through a highly biased perspective, because it clearly is discounting and not considering in the least the Native American perspective here. Let's take a look now. We went from the 1830s to 1880. Now let's go to 1910. In Polk County, Arkansas, described by resident Mitchell Cogburn, those woods were not like they are now. There wasn't all this undergrowth. The trees were large and there was a regular pasture underneath them. And that's one of the things that attracted the early settlers to these places. When they took the lands from the people who rightly inhabited them to begin with, the Native Americans, they were, these were delicious landscapes. They were landscapes that people, white settlers, and some of whom brought slaves with them, wanted to move into and were glad to get their hands on because of how many natural resources and opportunities there were to open up farms and settlements. Here's an image of what some of these areas might have looked like. This is a picture of an old growth shortleaf pine oak woodland from southern Missouri, from the Ozarks. This is taken in the late 1800s. You can see these are old growth trees here. There's a grassy layer on the ground. This represents what we call the pine blue stem ecosystem of the Missouri and Arkansas Ozarks. Okay, so we don't have that much anymore. It's very rare to find healthy open woodland ecosystems like that. Most everything has changed, like I showed you, that mercy, mercy me, things ain't what they used to be. So let's begin to teach you then how to see through all the green mass and to recognize if something is a forest or if something is actually a woodland that is masquerading as a forest, okay? So with a real woodland, please stand up, all right? So we're looking at this scene right here. Number one, don't be fooled by the biggest trees. The biggest trees sometimes are the youngest trees in a landscape. Yeah, you can go into places where there's an oak this big around, it's only 50 years old, or a tulip poplar, and there could be an even older specimen that's in the background that's 18 inches in diameter that's 200 years older. So age and size don't necessarily correlate. What I would want to know first in going into this is the landscape. Are you in a site that's relatively dry, rocky, sandy, sterile, that maybe fire would have moved across easily, or would grazing animals like bison have been played a role in? Later, I'll show you some exceptions to that, where maybe the edaphic conditions play an overriding factor, or maybe floodwaters from an adjacent river. Those are some exceptional things. But if you're in an upland, you want to kind of evaluate, you know, are you in a fire-prone landscape, probably first of all. And then if you are, take a look around and see if you could find sort of one of about 4 indicator trees that signify woodland conditions. Number one, there are 2 types of oaks. The first is a kind of white oak. Remember how we talked about the 2 divisions with the rounded lobes, the white flaky bark? So this is called a post oak specifically, Quercus stellata. That's a great indicator of woodland or even more open savanna conditions. Post oaks almost never grow in true forest. In fact, post oaks and this next one, the blackjack oak, well, actually all 4 of these cannot reproduce in closed forest. What does that mean? That means they can't have babies. Their young, their offspring, their acorns, their hickory nuts, their pine seeds cannot even germinate and survive to become reproductive adults again under forested shaded conditions. So what that means then is that if you see them in a forest, these are often going to be the oldest specimens in that example of a artificial forest. These are often going to be your oldest species. This pine, for example, the shortleaf pine shown right here in the right foreground, could easily be 150 to 200 years old. But I promise you, if you were to walk in and look in this understory, you will never find a baby shortleaf pine germinating. It will not happen. So mockernut hickory, post oak, blackjack oak, and shortleaf pine are always key indicators, species of trees that are woodland or savanna adapted. In fact, we go so far as to say they really are more grassland trees than they are forest trees. Now, how would you apply this? Well, for example, you might walk through this, and here's an old shortleaf pine here on the right. Here's another. All these little things in here are probably trees that are just kind of moving in that actually like shade. They like that leaf litter that's down here. These are oftentimes your inconsequential species that really don't add anything of value. But maybe this is an old post oak right here. Maybe back in here, one of this old tree might be an old blackjack oak back there. It takes somebody who knows their trees to be able to walk through and sort of read the forensics of this landscape. All right, so some basic questions. If you're trying to decide, is this a forest or a woodland? Number one, where is it? Is it in a ravine? Is it up on a hilltop? Is it out on an open rolling plain? So what is that landform? What is the slope in the aspect? Are you on a north-facing slope or a south-facing slope? What's the hydrology? You know, how's the water moving across the landscape? What's the surrounding landscape like? Are you just upslope on an escarpment from an otherwise flat plain that was historically an open prairie? What was here historically? What trees are present? What shrubs are present? And what types of grasses and forbs? Forbs are, again, broadleaf wildflowers. What kind are present? Some woodland savanna indicators, typically low diversity of tree species, usually just one or two species dominate the canopy. But those that are present are well adapted to drought and or fire. The mature trees are often shorter than what you would see in a forest. So they might be anywhere from 20, 30, 40, 50 feet tall in a woodland, as opposed to say 75, 80, 110, 130 feet tall in a forest. A lot of times, some of the trees will be short, stunted, a little bit gnarly. They might have heavy side branches. I'll show you some photographs of what these look like. Pine is present in acidic woodlands, but not in calcareous woodlands. There's oftentimes going to be a diversity of light-dependent, often drought-adapted understory plants. This includes both shrubs, wildflowers, as well as grasses and grass-like plants. By the way, let me introduce a new term. Grasses are just what they are. They're grasses. But then there's some grass-like plants that aren't really grass. These include things like sedges. And so combined, we call grasses and sedges and rushes basically grass-like plants. Go by a fairly generic term called graminoids. So woodlands have a strong dominance by graminoids on the ground floor. And of the wildflowers that you see in woodlands, they are especially rich in species that bloom in the summer and the fall. They do have some spring species, but summer and fall, as opposed to forests, which tend to have most of their flowering diversity comes up in the spring, right now, this time of year. At least seasonally dry, or they have other edaphic soil factors like a clay hardpan or shallow soil or rock at the surface. And the landscape context exposes the site to frequent sun, wind, fire, and I'm going to tell you about some types of woodlands that are exposed to frequent flooding as well. All right. If you're looking at a broader eco-regional perspective in terms of where you would find woodlands, I'm going to introduce several areas that you might expect them in a moment. We do see woodlands pretty much in all the ecoregions of Middle Tennessee. The Nashville Basin, the Highland Rim, the Pennyroyal Plain, as well as the Cumberland Plateau. And I'm going to show you through this lecture where specifically to see and expect woodlands. Remember that from a landscape context, the flatter and more open the terrain is, the more likely it is to have been a grassland. There is one key exception to that, and that is alluvial plains. Okay, if it's a big river bottom, like the Mississippi River alluvial plain, the more likely it is to have been a floodplain swamp adapted forest instead of an open grassland. But if it's an upland rolling plain that's not in the bottom of a river floodplain, then it's primarily going to be grassland. As this becomes more of a rolling landscape to lightly hilly, you see you go from open woodland into closed woodland. And if it gets super dissected, super hilly, this is where you expect forest. Now, we do even see woodlands in these places. Typically, they'll be on the highest, driest parts of these knobs and ridges, or on the tops of cliffs above rivers. I'm going to show you that in a minute. So in this case, I've just illustrated a few of the example scenarios where you might expect woodlands on a typical Middle Tennessee landscape. This is down in Cheatham County at Cheatham Wildlife Management Area. So we are going to talk about some of the woodlands which be right against the bank of the river. Those are controlled by frequent flooding that keeps those woodlands open. We may have woodlands that form right at the crest of the cliff line, right above the top of the bluff. You may have woodlands that are on the driest, highest hilltops and exposures, particularly where they're quite broad and they don't have a lot of ravines cutting down. Over here, you'd expect more forest. This broader, sort of less dissected areas where you'd expect more woodlands. And explain to me then why that might be here. Why would you expect this broader rolling landscape versus this deeply dissected landscape on the right? Why would this have more woodland development? Good. Yeah, we hadn't even talked about wind. That's a great one, Clayton. Wind's going to be able to blow across this landscape and keep it drier and more open and more prone to what? It's drier and droughty. What else? You got fire can move through easier. Now, let me introduce a new concept called fire compartment size. Okay. The fire compartments are directly related to how fractured the landscape is naturally. Okay. Here we have bigger fire compartments, meaning that if lightning were to strike a tree right there where that arrow is, and then begin to burn out, let's say in the middle of a drought, what's going to stop that fire to make it eventually burn itself out? What is it? Ravines, deep mesic humid ravines where the moisture levels down in here are too great. So the fire is not going to be able to burn down into the base of that ravine. Okay, so humidity and moisture. What else? What's going to stop it from coming over here? You got the river. Okay. Also, fire doesn't really like to burn down slope, so that's often a break. So what we can do then is map out, okay, here's very clearly a natural fire break with the Harpeth River. Maybe this is a fire break here with this ravine. Maybe another fire break is over there where the Cumberland River is up here in this valley. So this fire literally might have a fire compartment size that we can measure. Maybe it's 1,000 acres, right? That's the potential burn unit that a single fire could have under its own natural forces of wind and drought and conditions. The fire compartments over here are going to be smaller because it's more of a highly dissected landscape bordered by ravines and landscapes that are not really hospitable to fire. So your fire compartment size matters a lot when you start looking at whether something should be a forest or whether something should be more of a woodland or savanna landscape. And of course, prairies have very large fire compartment sizes that sometimes could burn millions of acres or hundreds of thousands of acres, depending on the prairie size. Now, aspect has a lot to play with the distinction between woodlands and forests. On this north-facing slope, you can see the compass bearing here. This is in the Ouachita Mountains of southwest Arkansas. On this north face, you could get white oak trees and northern red oaks, black gums and bitternut hickories, beeches, basswoods, and magnolias, all of which are mesophytic species. But as soon as you get up to the crest of this ridge, where there's an open rocky glade community, and come down the other side, notice that the trees pick up again, but you can see a clear dichotomy between how much hardwoods are on this side versus how much pines are incorporated on that side. So part of that is driven especially by being on a south-facing slope, by the steepness, by the shallowness of the rock near the surface. So the geology is playing a role. And all this has a very large fire compartment size, meaning that fire can just sweep through and go right up the slopes of those mountains. The fire is not going to be able to burn down this other side very far. So on this slope, notice how you can kind of see through. You can see sunlight reaching the ground quite easily. You've got shortleaf pine, post oak, black oak, and also a species of hickory over there called black hickory, all of which are woodland indicator species in that part of Arkansas, and some of them are woodland indicators here as well. This is just one more way to look at that using a color infrared image. This is a leaf, I think, this is the north facing slope. Here's the spine of the ridge right here. South facing slope is much hotter, more open, and you can see that greater amount of reflectivity, that light, indicating much more open conditions there on that south facing slope compared to the north facing slope. And then landscape matters from a bigger perspective, like we talked about, where you can have this very large open grassland system historically, where it meets an adjacent escarpment. You might expect woodlands to develop right here on this leading edge, because that's where the fires would have burned across these prairies and savannas and burn onto these slopes, up these slopes. And so you would expect a lot of this to have signatures of woodlands all down in those foothills. Okay. With that, let's talk about one last concept before we introduce a specific kind of ecosystem, one of the nature serve ecological systems I want you to remember. With the Southeastern Grasslands Institute, many people are shocked, I think, sometimes to learn that we're as interested in woodlands as we are in prairies and savannas. Because most people associate woodlands as being more akin to forest, more related to forest, because they both got a lot of trees, right? But from a functional perspective, woodlands are more akin to grasslands in several key ways. Number one, those dominant trees of woodlands are also the dominant trees of savannas and prairies. You can take a blackjack oak in a woodland, and it's just as at home in a savanna and a prairie, all of the above. But you can't take a beech tree from a forest and put it into a woodland or into a savanna or into a prairie. You can't take a big leaf magnolia or a bitternut hickory and put it into those settings. So there's a very fundamental difference. All those shade-loving species and moisture-loving species that are found in the understory forest are completely out of place once you put them into a more ecosystem like a woodland, savanna, and prairie. So for that reason then, almost all of the true grasslands that we can point to, take any kind of prairie, any savanna, any kind of glade or barren, and almost always, in fact, always, in nature, you would expect it to be bordered by woodland. So we can't rightfully segregate woodlands from grasslands because they always touch each other in nature. They're always the natural transition. And that's an important term for us to know. And you probably already know it. But what is that point where one ecosystem meets another? You know what that boundary is called? It's called an ecotone. Yeah, who said that? Good job. Good job, James. So ecotone is a really important concept. Unfortunately, because of our habit of mismanaging the land, ecotones have gotten sharper over time. Whereas historically, they were these blurred gradients from one to the other. Let's take this prairie example right here from Southwest Arkansas. Here, this is a fire maintained landscape. This is managed by the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission, whom Theo used to work for. And so these prairies out here are regularly burned with prescribed fire. And they also burn into these woodlands because they have all the signatures of woodlands and they're fire adapted. So they allow that fire to burn right into those woodlands. And so what you would expect is a continuum from open prairie conditions through sort of an open sunny edge all the way through until it drops off down into, say, a ravine, in which case it becomes more forested naturally. So it's in the zone here where you could draw a line in almost at any point, and you would expect under historical conditions for there to be a healthy functioning savanna woodland sort of ecotone. And it might look like these two scenes. Overhead, you've got scattered, pine trees or post oaks or blackjack oak trees or hickories. But notice that the understory is very much prairie-like or grassland. So you got that sort of perfect mix. Here's another scene from the Boston Mountains of Northwest Arkansas. And there's a reason why I'm showing you almost all of these examples are from Arkansas. And I'll get to that in a second. Notice how open it is and how much it's almost like a prairie going right under those trees. These plants that you see in the foreground, this beautiful wildflower called Culver's root, is now exceptionally rare in many places east of the Mississippi River. But it's 4 or 5 feet tall, and you've got some cone flowers in there. You've got basically a prairie-like landscape underneath this open scattered canopy. So why am I showing you all these examples from Arkansas? Why don't I just show you a bunch of examples from Tennessee or Kentucky? What do you think?
Are there any examples to show us?
Say again, Brandon?
Are there any examples to show us from these places?
That's a great question. And that's kind of what Jacob was alluding to. The reality is Arkansas has a much better legacy and history of recognizing these ecosystems for what they are. They're closer to the edge of the Great Plains, right? Arkansas is closer to this region that is widely known as naturally supporting grasslands. Their state agencies have a head start on those of us in Tennessee about using fire to manage these landscapes. When I first met Theo in 2008, he came over to Tennessee, and we were part of a national conference that was meeting in Nashville called the Natural Areas Conference. Theo and I get together, and at the end of the first day, that's when our friendship really began. And on the second day, he was excited because he was going to do a field trip and go look at one of our pristine natural areas here in Tennessee. And I was going to go in a different place and look at another. And he didn't go there with me because he had already been there and he was experienced with that. He went to this other site just outside Nashville. And so at the end of the day, we come back to the conference. We're excited, hang out and drink a beer together and get to know each other. And I was like, so what'd you think about Flat Rock, man? I know you must have enjoyed going to Flat Rock, Cedar Glades, and Barrens State Natural Area. And he said, well, I'll tell you, man, it ain't like Arkansas. And then, I got a little territorial. I was like, hey, dude, what are you doing thinking about coming over to my state, talking about my natural area, 1,000 acres of some really good habitat out there, right? He said, well, what's going on with all your woodlands, man? Where are they? I said, what do you mean? He said, it's so dense you can't walk through it. I said, dude, it's the way it's supposed to be. I said, man, my college professors, all of them had told us that. In fact, I even gave him a quote, which I had heard from my college professor, which is, these habitats don't burn. He said, that's the biggest crock of shit I've ever heard of in my life. He said, we've been doing this in Arkansas for decades, man. You need to come over to Arkansas and see what we're doing. And sure enough, right on the edge of these open grasslands, here in Tennessee, it's common to walk into an impenetrable thicket. You can't even beat your way into it, out of the grassland. But not in Arkansas. In Arkansas, they're burning all the way up into and through those grasslands into the forest, and they're open like this. And it was Theo in 2008, which opened my eyes to the fact that here east of the Mississippi River, in most places, we've missed it. We've really, really missed it. So Missouri and Arkansas are far ahead of the game and they have like a 30, 40-year head start on us. But it's not as simple as that. And I'm gonna illustrate this real quick. What we've come to realize, and this is why I spend so much time on this subject in this class, is we've come to realize that if you were to look at the whole eastern United States, that there's different levels of recognition and awareness depending on where you are in the South. If you're in Dallas, Texas, and your family came there in the 1880s when people were moving west, it's still mostly in your family knowledge that that area was a prairie historically, right? Most Texans identify with prairie. If you're in Arkansas, a lot of the early land surveyors and scientists who came there got there in time to map out the grasslands and to survey the grasslands and to talk about them and to tell stories about them. So by the time the early 1900s came, people still had a remembrance of prairies and savannas. But the Mississippi River isn't just an important barrier. It's also a significant jump back in time to an era when people were not writing stuff down. And we were losing ecosystems before the first scientists could document them. Guess what? Another significant thing that happened across this Mississippi River Divide, the camera was invented over here in the time frame that people started moving here. By the time when people were moving here, the camera had not even been invented. So we have pictures of the Great Plains from the 1850s and 1860s, right? We have no photographs of the original grasslands of central Tennessee. Why? Because they were largely gone before the 1830s. The camera was invented photography was only invented like the latest 1830s, 1840s. So there's a critical missing amount of knowledge here. And then we go back even further and we see that these grasslands, according to the historical record, were gone by the 1730s, 1750s. So what we see then is this wave of loss. 1750, landscapes east of the Blue Ridge had already been utterly transformed. By 1800, landscapes east of the Cumberland Plateau had largely been transformed. By 1860, let's say the Civil War, largely everything east of the Mississippi River had been transformed. And by about the 1900 mark or so, things really east of Oklahoma had been transformed. And then now, all the way out into West Texas, by the 1950s through 2000, we're still seeing the rapid erosion of biodiversity of those landscapes. So it depends on where you are on the spectrum. And we happen to be right there with Tennessee. So we're in this sort of zone where most people aren't aware that we had grasslands and open woodlands, because that knowledge didn't really start to develop until you cross the Mississippi River. It happens to do with the process of westward migration. That's why history is so important to the story. All right. So that's one reason why we're using so many photos from Arkansas. But I'm going to switch out now and show you a lot of sites from Tennessee. All right. Next up, this lack of knowledge of true healthy woodlands, true savannas, and true prairies, as opposed to just calling everything with trees forest, is only now being worked out. When I mean only now being resolved, I mean to tell you that only in the past 5 years has a lot of this even started being spoken about. That's how fresh into this we are. And 2013 was a really fundamental year for two reasons. Number one, the year 2013, I'm gonna switch off to another PowerPoint and show you this, and then I'm gonna come back to this. And then we're gonna take a break. Hang on one second. Gosh, I don't know why this thing's taking forever today, probably because I got a million things on my desktop. Couldn't be that, could it? Couldn't be those turkeys and fire ants and all that stuff. Let me find this real quick here. All right, here we go. We're gonna look at this slide and we're gonna take a break. So 2013, not that long ago, right? Just 11 years ago. That was the year I got tenure. So it feels like it was yesterday. Not a long time, but it was two very big things happened in that year. Number one of the most landmark books of North American ecology was published, called Forgotten Grasslands of the South by Dr. Reed Noss. Today, Reed works for the Southeastern Grasslands Institute as our chief as our chief scientist. Oh, dadgummit. Chief Science Advisor. My apologies. I've gone through three terms. Chief Science Advisor. Let me restate that. Reed Noss today works for SGI as our Chief Science Advisor. Reed is very gifted as an ecologist and is written about a number of immense topics, from the redwood forest to major carnivores like wolf populations in Yellowstone, you name it. And he's considered to be one of the top ecologists in North America. He is one of the top 500 published authors across all genres of all time. He's exceedingly well cited in the scientific literature. So when someone like Reed Noss speaks, people listen. When he writes books, and I think he's on his like 9th book now, people listen, they read them, they cite them prolifically. And what Reed did was he opened our eyes to the realization that the southeastern United States has an abundance of grassland types. This was in 2013 that his book was published. One of the other things then that he helped us to think about was a huge diversity of types of grassland landscapes, many of which bleed over into woodland types, right? Like especially these savannas that we're going to talk about, these glades and barrens that also grade into woodlands. Prairies, like we said, are almost always bordered by woodlands. One of the things that he offered us were a couple of good definitions for these grassy landscapes. And you can see by reading these how much overlap there is with woodlands. A grassland is any community in which the grass layer with its associated forbs is the dominant layer in terms of either total cover or biomass or both. What do you do in a system where, yes, there's trees overhead, but the whole ground floor is dominated by grasses? Copeland in 1991 adds to that and says, in some instances, shrubs or trees emerge above the canopy as scattered individuals to form savannas. An ecosystem may be designated a grassland when the canopy of grasses is continuous or nearly so. So this paves the way for recognizing treed grasslands, of which savannas clearly fit the bill, but also some types of woodlands do as well. They're definitely in sort of this blurry category. Here's a great example photograph, another Arkansas woodland shown here. But now I want to hit the last point, and before we take a break, of another thing that happened in 2013. In this same year, two of our friends, two of the leading conservation organizations in the world, World Wildlife Fund and NatureServe, you've already been introduced to NatureServe, together they worked on a project to map North America's grasslands. And you can see here, they've mapped the Great Plains, they've mapped the Chihuahua Desert grasslands, they've mapped the Great Basin grasslands, the grasslands of Washington and Idaho and Oregon called the Palouse Prairie, and they've mapped significant areas of grasslands in Central California. But in the area that is the Southeastern Grasslands Institute focal region, which is parts of 24 states, going from Long Island to central Missouri down to Texas and Florida, the only places that they map grasslands are right on the edge of the Great Plains and what's called the coastal prairies of Texas and Louisiana. They missed millions and millions and millions of acres. And the question is why? Well, part of that why is that erosion of knowledge, right? Both scientists and the average everyday people, all the way up until very recently, have been picturing the Southeast as a totally open, it's a totally forested landscape. Really, that's kind of what we began this class with, right? And we've been dispelling that notion again and again and again with paleontological evidence from the fossil record, looking at various landforms and ecoregions, citing historical quotes and observations all throughout the different points of recorded history. And it points to that, yes, indeed, we do have a lot of grasslands, and we'll talk about more of those. We also have a lot of woodlands. The final thing then before break is, because of this pervasive lack of awareness at the highest levels of American conservation, and this is not to take anything away from our friends who are some of the world leaders in conservation, like World Wildlife Fund and NatureServe, but they missed it. They missed it. And in 2013, the same year, Reed Noss publishes this landmark book, opening our eyes to the fact that, yes, indeed, this geography not only has grasslands, but 40% of the eastern landscape likely had grasslands. And I want you to go back and look also at who wrote the foreword to Reed Noss's book, the legendary Harvard biologist, E.O. Wilson. Now, he goes on to write in there, he says that the southern grassland biome, write that down. That's the last thing I want to say before break. The southern grassland biome coins a new term in 2013. The southern grassland biome, when it is properly defined to include the longleaf pine savannas and its intermittent sort of hardwood types of woodlands, is probably the richest terrestrial biome in all of North America. The southern grassland biome should be a priority goal in America's environmental movement. This is E.O. Wilson, the author of books like Biophilia and Half Earth. The person who's regularly quoted on CNN and the New York Times and National Geographic, the leading founder of the principle of island biogeography theory. You know, when E.O. Wilson speaks, people listen. But 11 years ago, when E.O. Wilson wrote these words, as a man going into his 90s or thereabouts, his words fell on deaf ears. And you can see that people didn't pick it up. They still ran with this notion and promoted this notion of the East as a densely forested landscape. And now what are we seeing the consequences of it? The lack of awareness of open, healthy ecosystems like woodlands, savannas, and prairies has been there all along. People have always neglected these landscapes. They've always abused these landscapes. These have been the places they moved to first and settled into and created towns and farms and cities. And so now here we are facing the extinction of a bird like bobwhite quail that was hunted commonly just 20, 30, 40 years ago. And people are scratching their head and coming up with all these excuses about why it's failing and why it's not working. And here, what the final point is, that even the leading conservation organizations, the leading scientists, have missed this epic boat. They missed it. By declaring that everything was forest, they missed the fact that 40% of the landscape was open and is needed to be open by so much of our biodiversity. All right, let's take a break. We're going to come back. We're going to figure out how this matters when we're trying to classify woodlands. They just get missed in the whole picture and classified instead as forest. All right, while we're waiting on Clayton to get back, I don't know if this is the place to start it or not, but I'm gonna write it here, and I'm gonna see how long it lasts. Maybe it might get in the way of other classes. I don't know. what I'm gonna do is kind of keep a running list. Maybe this will be for you more than anything. So each class period from here through the rest of the semester, we're gonna keep a running list of all the ecological systems that we identify, okay? So far, there's two types that we've already touched on. One is the South Central Interior Mesophytic Forest. Okay. And then we noted how as you go up in those ravines to the ridge tops, things get more oak dominated, but you're largely still in sort of the moist phase of forest, right? But as you switch into more oak dominated moist forest, you leave this system as you climb those hills and you get into what's called a southern interior low plateau. Dry mesic oak forest. And I want to here, we're going to have to recognize something. So part of the legacy of everybody missing these woodlands and savannas and grasslands is that we call everything a forest based on the way we perceive it to be today. We classify the landscape as it appeared in the late 20th century. And this is heavily missing a lot of stuff. And what it's doing is it's sort of coupling together multiple different kinds of oak dominated, by the way, dry mesic oak forest, key components. So what it's doing is sort of lumping all together in this one broad ecological system, mesic oak forest. Remember, these are the ones I said were down in those ravines that were oak dominated. Those are true forests. They just happen to be oak dominated, right? But then they're also lumping in things like submesic oak, which begins to kind of straddle the divide between forest and woodland. Okay, there are a few circumstances where we might have a xeric oak forest, but those are really rare. When you get into the xeric end of the spectrum, almost everything in our region mostly shifts toward more of a woodland dominated system that's just fire suppressed and more closed in and artificial. So forest, I'm going to leave here because it applies to a minority of the cases, but mostly these are truly woodlands. Okay. We also then have some hydroxeric, which means they start out wet and then they go to dry. Oak flatwoods, which I'm going to talk about, which are a type of woodland that just goes between these fluctuations from wet to dry. And what is missing here from this entire equation? What do you not see that I've written down yet? If you were to follow forests from the most closed end of the spectrum, with trees being the dominant feature, right? What's that? So imagine you got an oak forest, really closed, with 80 to 100% tree canopy, right? Now we step into, from 80%, we get into 75% oak canopy cover, and 60%, and 50%, and 40%. Kiki just asked for a break. You know, what is the percent canopy coverage of a woodland? It's usually 80 to about 30%. Okay, that's the woodland end of portion of the spectrum. But what's over there below 30%? Savannas. Okay, savannas typically are in that 30 to 40, down to about 20 or 10% range, with prairies being usually less than 10% tree cover. So what's missing from our region, east of the Mississippi River, is the recognition of savannas at all. They don't exist really in most of the classification for Tennessee and Kentucky because 20th century ecologists didn't think that they existed. They never bothered to go back and check the early historical writings or the earliest land surveys. They just took it for granted what scientists and conservationists said in the 1930s, 40s, 20s, 50s, 80s, 90s. And that's the way it was taught to me in the 90s and the 2000s. And they never bothered to go back and see what did the record actually say about these landscapes from earlier time periods. So savannas are the great missing element. And the reason I point this out is because under this classification, we've hit a new ecological system in a sense, but we really haven't, because we've talked about it with respect to the forested examples, the oak dominated forest examples, but about right here, we're gonna apply it. Here, let's apply it strictly as a forest. Here, we're gonna modify this and call it the southern, this is our own sort of modification. Southern Interior Low Plateau. Let's go with dry oak, woodland, and savanna. Apologies for writing back there. Let's put that in quotes so that we understand that's not an official nature serve ecological system. That's going to be ours. We're going to call it that. We're going to basically separate this into part A and B. The A part remains a forest type that's more mesic and closed. The B part, we're going to call more of a woodland savanna in the spectrum. The difficult part, of course, is I can't go back and change the official name. It is the way it is. It's the way it's been published. Southern Interior Low Plateau Dry Mesic Oak Forest. So what does that do if you're in a college classroom? What does that do if you're writing a conservation guide that the Nature Conservancy is implementing? What does it do if you're, teaching this stuff? What does it do? It biases it all toward what? Being a forest. Most people don't understand the nuance between forest, woodland, savanna, prairie. They think if it's got trees, a lot of trees, it's forest, right? Plant 1 billion trees, plant 1 trillion trees. Let's save the world. Most people don't stop to think about the nuance of whether it should be shortleaf pine, post oak, black-jacked oak dominated woodland, or whether it should be a white oak, black oak, tulip poplar, beech forest. But it matters to biodiversity. It matters to ecology. It matters to species. So if we don't get it right, and we're teaching it wrong for the entire 20th century, in the first decade of the 2010s, of the 21st century, SGI literally is on the cusp of a revolution of knowledge in America, because we were the front runners, led initially by our chief science advisor, Dr. Reed Noss, picked up by Theo and myself, and now propagated into a brand new organization that is reaching all of America, to let the rest of the country know that, hey, you guys screwed up. You missed our grassy landscapes. And now our species are paying a price. So what's the key to overturning? How do we overturn? What matters in a academic world? Yeah, you got to have something to back it up, right? You got to have credibility. You can't have, even though I'm a tenured full professor at Austin Peay State University, but I'm not at one of the leading colleges in the land. I'm not at Harvard University. I'm not E.O. Wilson, whose writings fell on deaf ears 11 years ago. So to change that, sure, I can go and do all the public speaking events I can do. I'm going to give a TEDx talk this year. I'm going to do videos, and we've got a Facebook page and a presence, and we're doing projects. We're raising money. All that's great, but we got to start backing it up with some science and with some publications and some data. So one of the ways that we're going to get out with this in a big way is we're going to publish this next year in National Geographic Magazine. That's a great launching point to help begin to turn the tide of this story. And we have some publications in the works that are helping to tell this story. So, and that's where folks like you come into play. Graduate students and my colleagues here at Austin Peay and in other institutions. So SGI is not only working with other colleagues, but we're supporting a graduate stipend for a student at the University of Vermont to help tackle this problem. We're collaborating with numerous academicians at other places like Marshall University, the University of Tennessee, and other places to help support this work, so we can actually get a lot of this stuff out there and stop propagating a bunch of bad science. All right, So with that, we have to kind of make up our own classification at this point. Because the existing classification doesn't specifically allow woodlands and savannas, but that's the only place, that's the only system you would place woodlands unless you created an entirely new name, which, you know, we can't go back and alter a system that now has been in use for 30 years very easily. All right, let's divide woodlands up into about 5 categories. The first category, and this, by the way, is going to be a lecture that's going to take us through probably all of next Thursday's lecture as well. First of all, let's talk about upland woodlands. And what we mean by that are the woodlands essentially that are on broad sort of rolling uplands, kind of like some of those diagrams I've talked about. Broad ridges, sort of rolling to slightly hilly landscapes, often associated with dry conditions. The geology is usually in our region. This is restricted to our region here. Mostly it's chert, gravel, or sandstone. Canopy varies from open, 30–40%, historically to 75–80%. Fire and grazing were important in historical examples, but they're almost non-existent in central Tennessee. Very few woodlands in central Tennessee or Kentucky are effectively being managed anymore. There are primary edaphic factors like shallow soils can also be important, but primary threats include fire suppression, afforestation, continuing to get denser as a forest, and the loss of the herbaceous layer. These are all critically important factors. If we look at this map, which again, I'm going to ask you on a final exam kind of what this map refers to. This is a map that is a model-based map that shows the predicted original distribution of ecosystems as they appeared before European settlement. So, you know, just take it back to whatever date, 1770 or 1800. This is back to a time when before European Americans would have aggressively colonized this region. If we look at that then, specifically knowing where the woodlands were, pretty much anything that is the medium shade of green here to the lightest shades of green right in here, those would have been your woodland environments according to this map. And I do think this map is pretty accurate. There are some places where it's inaccurate, and I'll point those out. But these big broad uplands, like you see around Dixon, for example, this shows that this area had a lot of these open sort of medium green colors. Let's take a look at what kind of canopy coverage that would suggest. And based on what I'm pointing to here, looking at the legend up there, what do you think? Okay, oak open woodland with a 20–50% tree canopy, right? Look at all this around it. This is suggesting that a lot of this around it was even an oak closed woodland with a 50–80% canopy coverage. So woodlands would have dominated. They really would have been what most of Middle Tennessee would have been a woodland, not a closed canopy forest. Now, as you look beyond or more open than the open oak woodland, and by the way, that 20–50% canopy kind of overlaps with the most closed extreme of the savanna with a more open woodland. So I would like to kind of have you guys think about this as kind of a savanna woodland mosaic. In fact, the organization NatureServe, which I've mentioned to you several times, they are the ones that are the leading agency responsible for classifying America's vegetation. They now, in their most recent edits to the National Vegetation Classification, have renamed these as savanna woodlands, hyphenated. And that's because we really can't always tease them apart very naturally. So I think these things here that were in that 20–50% canopy category, a lot of these green zones would have been savanna woodlands as a hyphenated group. Again, on this landscape, this open, broad, rolling upland here would have been a savanna woodland primarily. You could have had closed woodland. So this is that 20–50% canopy cover here. You could have had closed woodland along the tops of these ridges right in here in that 50–80% tree canopy cover. Now, one of the other things that SGI is working on is we're partnering with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and funded by the National Park Service to do the following. It's a pretty ambitious exercise, but we are taking, excuse me, we're taking all of the ecosystems of the southeastern grasslands focal region. That's that green zone I showed you earlier from New York to Florida to Missouri. And we're taking that and we basically have built a database where along the top row are all the ecosystems. And this amounts to about 1,800 columns of information. Okay. So every forest type, every marsh type, every prairie type, we're given it a name along the top header, right? And then along this line, along this axis, we're putting all the plant species known in the southeastern United States. Anybody hesitate to guess how many that is? 11,000. So we take species 1 through 11,000 here. And then what we're doing is we're coding each species. So let's say, for example, white oak, or let's go with blackjack oak, Quercus marylandica. Okay. We put the different ecosystems that it can thrive in or not along the top, all 1,800 of them. And then we assign that all kinds of different information. One of the things that we're doing for all 11,000 species, and this is involving a collaborative effort of many different scientists, is we're scoring the species on a scale of 1 to 9 that is basically a reflection of how open does that species need an ecosystem to be. If it's a 9, then that's an obligate species of open landscapes. It can only reproduce and it can only be highly vigorous with a lot of sunlight. If it's a 1, then that basically means it loves forest. It loves shaded environments like the undersides of cliffs or behind waterfalls or the deepest depths of a forested ravine. And so we're arriving at these numbers that basically reflect 2 values. One is heliophytism, which is how much sunlight does it want. And that's a separate score. So we basically come through for all 11,000 species, and we would give something like blackjack oak, would probably get an 8 or a 9 in terms of a heliophytism score. How much sunlight does it need? The other thing we have to then measure is what is its conservatism? Okay. If you walk into a garden spot out behind your grandmother's house, it's going to be full of weeds. It's going to be full of non-native species popping up between the rows of corn. Those are weedy, non-conservative species. So if we're giving it its own score, let's say from 1 to 9, actually usually they go from 1 to 10, then we would give a weedy species that is also native might get a score of 1 or 2. What we want to know though, and this is sort of the sweet spot, is when is something both in need of high sunlight and also is it highly conservative, right? Is it a species that needs little disturbance by man and it needs a high amount of sunlight? What should that tell you? It should tell you concentrations of species that are adapted to these highly relictual, conservative, very high quality open ecosystems. That's what we're trying to find. So we come in and we give it a conservatism score then, in the case of blackjack oak, maybe we get a conservatism score of something like a 7. We put those 2 variables together and it gives us an index value for that particular species. But what's important is one species alone doesn't really matter. But what if we go in and we do a site inventory of a savanna and we document 202 species? Every one of them now we can assign a heliophytism score to and conservatism score to. So by the time we get down to 202 species that we've documented, we can then compile a total score for that site that tells us, does that site, is it in good shape? Is it in bad shape? Is it leaning more toward a grassland site or is it leaning more toward a forest site? This is some pretty important work that we're about to do. And the reason I really bring this up is that most of the species that are in your open woodlands back into prairie, kind of like that grassland woodland continuum I talked about, are going to be dominated by species that are in this range right here of your 6, 7s, 8s, and 9s when you combine with both conservatism and heliophytism. All right, let's take a look at some examples of healthy woodlands. Just three photos here to show you. This again are Arkansas photos. All right, beautiful, healthy, open woodland. This looks exactly probably like it would have 500 years ago. Beautiful open structure, light reaching the floor, loads of wildflower diversity on the ground. These are mostly summer, fall blooming sunflowers. These trees are ancient, old growth trees. Every one of these trees is probably in excess of 250 years old. Some of them may be 300 years old. These are mostly post oaks. They have all the indicators of old growth. They're not that tall, but for a woodland, they have all the indicators of old growth conditions. Notice how gnarled and stunted the canopy is. And notice that a lot of the trunks may have sort of these knots on them like this. That indicates former locations of branches. And what happens is these trees will go through a self-pruning process where they'll drop their lowest branches as they get too crowded. And then because of that, they're keeping their space. Their lower branches are often growing sort of out horizontally, taking advantage of that extra sunlight. A lot of the trees may have broken tops. That's an indicator of old growth conditions where the tops have been broken out of them. Oftentimes also these branches will be very contorted and twisted, indicating where maybe it used to grow up like this, and then that portion broke off in a windstorm, and it began to redirect and grow. So they often have these sort of zigzag side branches. These in combination suggest an old site with a lot of antiquity. This is a fire managed landscape. Here's another beautiful example of a woodland in Arkansas. Lots of really great plants for pollinators and wildlife on the ground. Again, it's almost like a prairie underneath forest. It's a little bit of a hybrid between those. Now, let's take a look at some not so healthy woodlands. Tennessee wishes it just had a few acres of what I just showed you. But sadly, in our state, most of our woodlands are in a desperate state of affairs. All right. These are two photos taken on the same ridge system in Land Between the Lakes. Land Between the Lakes is, I don't know, 100,000 acres. Lots of potential for great habitat. But sadly, Land Between the Lakes has been poorly mismanaged for decades. And now, when there should be an opportunity to really manage it the best that we possibly can, we have multiple forces working against it. Number one, the Forest Service doesn't have enough money to consistently put into sustained high-quality restoration efforts. They do piecemeal work over here, they do piecemeal work over here, and they don't do anything with real high quality at this particular forest unit. This is not true everywhere. This is on this particular unit. And so because the work is not done with enough fire, often enough, sustained enough, that's one part of the problem. The second part of the problem then is if you don't put enough fire often enough, and you don't sort of regularly manage that, you don't achieve the results that you tell everybody you want to achieve. And so you wind up with blackberry thickets and greenbrier thickets and an overgrowth of poison ivy and a bunch of resprouts of oak trees that keep bouncing back. And so what happens then is a lot of the conservation groups that are anti-cutting trees come out of the woodwork and say, ha ha, yeah, see there? We knew you couldn't do this right. We knew you'd screw it up. See, you've turned this beautiful forest into a massive regrowth thicket of nothing but oak, regenerating oak saplings and greenbrier and poison ivy, and it just beats the hell and it looks terrible. And they got a point. But on these two ends of the spectrum, you have a well-intentioned federal agency thinking they want to do the right thing, and you have a well-intentioned conservation pro-forest advocacy group who's bringing everybody out of the woodwork to shut this down. And in the meantime, what's missing is something in the middle, right? More resources, more recognition, more awareness. And both sides are fighting against each other. And in the meantime, it's shutting it down and shutting the appropriate path down. And so these are all examples of old growth, stunted woodlands at Land Between the Lakes. If you've ever been to the elk and bison prairie, this is just immediately northeast of that on a ridge that we were hired to survey a few years ago. Blackjack oaks shrouded basically in a thicket. Old post oaks here, generally shrouded in the background by a dense thicket. So one of the keys right away, we've already alluded to in identifying this as an open woodland, is the fact that we've got two of the trees that are indicators here: blackjack oak and post oaks. So there's the blackjack oak leaf, very distinctive, sort of triangular with these broad three lobes at the top. Very thick black bark that's extremely adapted to fire. Some unpublished studies that have looked at tree ring research in these area have indicated that these trees back in the late 1700s were adapted to being burned probably about every 5 to 7 years. So there was a pretty frequent reoccurrence of fire in these landscapes. Post oaks have that sort of traditional cross-shaped leaf that you see right there. Now, in some examples, we can see, and remember, topography matters. If you're on the very back of a ridge that is very sandy, gravelly, it's going to affect how big your trees can grow. So you may have old growth trees that are only 20 to 30 feet tall, depending on how poor the soil is they're growing on. In other cases, you may have old growth trees that are naturally getting bigger if they're on a little bit more of a slope or with better soil. In any case, this is an old growth tree from Arkansas. A lot of people refer to these as wolf trees. Another term that I've heard people use are called radiant trees. Basically, it's just in recognition that they are old growth. They have these very radiating branches that spread out. But these are great indicators for historic savannas and woodlands with these widespreading canopy branches. I have no idea. I guess haggard old wolf tree. I have no idea what the connection is. Another common tree that we see, I mentioned earlier, is mockernut hickory. We have several hickory species in Tennessee. Most hickories, they like forests. They like floodplains. Mockernuts like historically savannas and open woodlands. So again, just because it's a hickory doesn't matter. Just because it's an oak doesn't matter. And you need to pay attention to which species it is. That's why it's important to know your species. Shortleaf pine, great indicator. All right. Now, above those, beyond those 4 or 5 species I mentioned that are really indicator species for woodlands to look for in the canopy, let's bring it down now to the subcanopy or to the shrub layer. In this particular setting, there are a few species that you want to be really mindful of. One are crab apples. Now, there are both Asiatic crab apples that have been planted in everybody's yards. I'm not talking about those. Many of those are flowering right now. I'm talking about native crab apples, of which we have a couple species. They like woodlands, they like savannas, and they're almost all rapidly disappearing. They have these thick, when they're grown out in a completely open space like this former savanna down south of Clarksville, they have these very thick tangled branches, which are great for nesting songbirds. They are thorny. You can see the thorns here. So they offer a lot of protective advantage. They're beautiful flowering trees as well. They have fleshy fruits for a variety of wildlife. They're great for pollinators. But as they grow and get swallowed up by increasingly dense forests, these trees become, they're not that long lived and they rapidly will die. And so many of them are on their last leg currently. There's an abundance of different fruit producing and nut producing species that are disappearing from these woodland landscapes. American hazelnut is this shrub with multi-stemmed sort of small species, typically, anywhere from 5 to 10 feet tall, can be a robust shrub. Here's what the nuts look like, hazelnuts roasting at Christmas time kind of thing. That's chestnuts, but also hazelnuts. Very common species in dry woodlands, but sadly is rapidly disappearing. So what happens when these woodlands become artificial forests is species like hazelnut and crabapple, they don't flower and they don't set fruit. So their reproductive vigor dramatically decreases. And then they just remain sterile and vegetative for decades until eventually they begin to die and wither unless they get enough light to rebound and to reproduce. A very common short shrub is called New Jersey tea. This is exceedingly important for the mottled dusky wing butterfly. The mottled dusky wing will not visit any other species on Earth. It is a obligate to this as its host plant. So if you take New Jersey tea out of the landscape, you create the pathway to extinction for mottled dusky wing butterflies. There's only a couple places in Tennessee now in restored woodlands and savannas where this species is really flourishing. And here's a host of small shrub species, things like wild plums, the native prairie willow, several species of wild native roses, poison oak, by the way. Most people say, oh, I got a case of poison oak last week. Buddy, you ain't never seen poison oak a day in your life, brother. You got poison ivy or you ran into Virginia creeper, but true poison oak is exceptionally uncommon in Tennessee. It's only found in the highest quality sandy, gravelly woodlands along the southern border of Tennessee. Various types of blueberry members, hawthorns, hazelnuts, as we talked about, and various other shrubs, many of which are prolific flowering and fruiting species that many species of wildlife depend on. Yeah, got it? All right, so shrubs of woodlands and savannas are disappearing rapidly. And in many ways, they are paralleling the disappearance of species like northern bobwhite, quail. Many people think about quail as needing shrubby grasslands, shrubby savannas, shrubby woodlands. They really do require an ample amount of shrub cover. Now, on the flip side, if we're aggressively restoring woodlands too much, too aggressively, if we use fire too frequently, guess what? It burns up that shrub layer. We're applying fire every year, for example, in a system that only is supposed to be getting fire every 5 to 7 years. We may be really promoting the grass layer. We may be okay promoting the right trees, but we may be decimating the shrub layer that's supposed to be there. And that's actually a very common mistake that we're seeing in woodlands and savannas. Now, let's talk about the herb and graminoid layer. Oftentimes, especially, and by the way, this is not a high quality woodland. This is in a very early stage of restoration. But you would walk into this, and a lot of times, if you want to assess whether it has any potential to be a true woodland or not, or savanna, the best place to look for it is in these light gaps, or to look, if it's in a more closed-in example, oftentimes the base of these tree trunks will be slightly elevated and drier, and that's where you might find a lot of these residual forbs and graminoids hanging out, is right at the bases of those trees. Let's take a look at what some of the key plants are. Native grasses of a few types, but one of the big types for woodlands and savannas is called little bluestem. Now, I don't care that you know the scientific name. I put it up here, Schizocarium scoparium, but just want you to be generally familiar. Look at how fine the fuels are that little bluestem creates. Very narrow foliage. When it dries out, especially if there's a lot of grass on the ground layer, it carries fire very rapidly through these understories of these woodlands and savannas. Another grass that's really common to woodlands and savannas that you probably have seen, but maybe you didn't know, some people call it curlicue grass. It's actually called poverty oak grass. And you'll see that it's got both bright green leaves and these older last year sort of beige color leaves, but it just grows in this tight sort of little round layer, round cushion. And the leaves are very curly and very twisted. But this is a really common species of grass in woodlands. In healthier woodlands that are really flourishing, you get lots of flowering plant diversity, like especially native sunflowers. A lot of people, a lot of non-botanists refer to these as DYCs. And that's because these particular types of flowers that have these sort of daisy-like heads are in a group of plant family called the composite family. And so they refer to these as damn yellow composites because they're so hard to identify. You get into a good, healthy woodland, there could be just a super diversity of damn yellow composites. And unless you're a trained botanist, they can be very challenging to work your way through these. Nowadays, we have tools like iNaturalist and Seed, which actually make it a lot easier to do plant identification compared to, say, 10 years ago. But lots of sunflowers, lots of aster diversity, coneflowers, and goldenrods, all of which are critically important to providing the basic elements of the whole food chain. These are what really determine which species of animals should be in an ecosystem. But if you take these out because of too much shade and too much woody plant growth, it has a detrimental effect on wildlife. Blazing stars are some particularly important members of open woodland communities. These beautiful pink blossom members of the composite family, great for pollinators. Lots of native peas, native legumes. Most of these that grow in woodlands, all the pea family members have this sort of distinctive, most of them have this distinctive shaped flower. And a lot of them have sort of this leaf that's divided into three parts that you see here, three-parted leaves. These plants are really important for, they have a symbiotic relationship with nitrogen fixing bacteria. What's the word I'm looking for? Mycorrhizae, yeah. And so they help to add nitrogen to the soil and increase soil fertility. And so you probably run into some of these things literally. You've gotten these stick tights, I'm sure, on your jeans. These are really common. You get into some woodlands, there could be, 15 to 20 different species of legumes. There might be 6 or 7 species just of this type that sticks to your legs, which is a particular group called the tick trefoils. Lots of native lespedezas. Again, there's that three-parted leaf that you see right there. You could have 5 or 6 species in a single site. Lots of different pea diversity in these types of woodlands. In general, I mean, woodlands are highly biodiverse. In fact, they're probably one of our most diverse ecosystems because they do kind of combine elements of both forest and grasslands all into one. Surprising levels of diversity. Milkweeds, which are super important for monarch butterflies, can be very diverse in these systems as well. And a lot of, while they are particularly well known for their summer and fall blooming species, there are spring blooming species too that are coming out right now that are in woodlands. Sadly, though, these are among the first to disappear if we build up too much of a leaf layer and don't properly manage them. But guess what? If we take it the other way and we burn them too aggressively, oftentimes, for some reason, a lot of people in this region over the past 20, 30, 40 years across the interior parts of the South have started burning in the spring, sometimes burning up through March and April. What that does, though, if you do it once, it's not a big deal. But if you do it repeatedly, every other year or every 3 years, always burning it in the spring, you're going to set back and eventually lead to the disappearance of your early spring blooming wildflower species that need that highlight condition of the woodland floor. So again and again and again, we've seen by not being conscientious of the nuance involved in woodland and savanna management, we can actually do great harm. We think we're, in fact, our friends with the Nature Conservancy, I love them, have their hat. There's a common term out there, you see it all over social media, good fire, hashtag good fire, hashtag good fire, right? There's really no such thing as all fires are good. There are definitely cases where fire can get out of hand and become problematic for people. We all know that. We see it all the time. But even when used under highly controlled scenarios, there are times we might be burning, we should not be burning. We may be burning at the wrong season. We may be burning out of sync with pollinators. We may be burning an entire site. Like when we restore Dunbar Cave Prairie, or let me not use that as an example. Let me use Google Prairie as an example. We don't burn all 50 acres at once. If we did, we would be creating a disastrous condition for box turtles and small mammals and certain types of insects that can't move easily, that rely on that as a refuge. So if you burn all of the site every time you burn, you really are putting a great risk to biodiversity. Now, back in the days when fire could burn where it would on its own, it naturally left many areas unburned, some areas burned, but not everything burned all the time. So you have these natural islands of unburned habitat the species would just move into and out of. But when all we have left is 0.01%, and then we try to burn all of that 0.01%, we may be thinking we're doing good, but we're actually doing more harm than good by too aggressively using fire. Now, we talk about ferns being especially common in forest, but there are some woodland savanna adapted ferns like the bracken fern, which is common all across the northern hemisphere. You can go to Siberia, Norway, Quebec, Alaska, but you can also go to the savannas of Alabama. But this is one species where if we get off track with too much fire or the wrong season of fire, this species, when it's healthy and sort of has the right amount of what it needs, it forms little colonies here or maybe scattered individuals, and they're connected underground by rhizomes. But if we go too aggressively one way or the other, this entire thing will become a monoculture of bracken to the exclusion of the graminoids and the orchids and the small shrubs. And we've done some damage. So you really have to be very aware. And we have to, and sadly, a lot of the science is lacking on this because, we're still just now knowing what to call it, right? That's kind of the first step of recognition. You got to know how to classify it first. So then you can research it properly and understand it. So that's what is obviously needs to come next. In the last few minutes that I've got, let's talk about some clues to fire suppressed woodlands. One, I've already shown you. If you got these trees and they're kind of growing in closed canopy conditions, you got a problem. This definitely needs another solution to become more open. Now, it is beyond the intentions of this class to go into the nuances of how to restore these ecosystems. That really ought to be another class that we don't currently have in our curriculum. But one of the things that's happening is, as long as these stay closed, these trees are dropping those leaves. All that you see in here is now building up with this leaf litter, and that's going to be taken advantage of by species that need more moisture and the species that need more shade. And that's where these boogers come in, okay? You start getting sugar maple, and beech, and southern red oak, and red maple. These are the more shade adapted, moisture adapted, and they are able to come up in the understory of a fire-starved woodland. Very important term here. A lot of publications have been focused on this topic. It's called mesification. It's basically we're intensifying the mesic nature of woodlands, driving them into forests artificially. Mesification, there's a very robust literature about mesification. But as we do, we can walk into the same woodlands and see species suffering that need light. This is wild quinine. It's a prairie savanna open woodland adapted species. This plant right here is probably a half-century old, but yet it's only got 1 or 2 leaves. It's not flowering, and it's going to stay like this probably for most of my lifetime, if it's lucky enough to survive at all. The only thing that will ever bring this back is if we open the canopy back up and give it what it needs, but it's got to be the right balance. All right, 2 more minutes and the last key points. Some other evidences of fire-starved conditions. We see a lack of recruitment. We do not see baby blackjack oaks. In fact, I have spent 30 years of my career looking and searching for a baby blackjack oak germinating from an acorn. I've only seen it one time ever, and this is on a quail plantation in Alabama where they burn almost every year, about 6,000 acres a year. This almost never happens. It's seedling root. Short-leaf pines regenerating. Again, that's very rare these days. Dead or dying stems of light-dependent species. Here's a crabapple, completely shrouded in by shade conditions. And it'll be lucky if it survives another 10 or 15 years under these conditions. Very low reproduction of long-lived conservative sun-loving species. So if you have people like, these folks who are ecologists setting up plots, this is a plot that is fire-starved, shade-suppressed. Look at all that leaf litter. You've got poison ivy and sassafras seedlings. You've got a bunch of ecological shit that doesn't amount to hill beans. If you go into a site that's being properly managed, you got diversity of grasses and wildflower species. You might have 5 species in this square meter plot. You can have 25 species in this square meter plot, or 30, or 40. The record is 52 species in a single square meter in a North American woodland. And with that, I'm I'm out of time. And we'll pick this back up on Thursday. We'll go through the various other kinds of woodlands. We'll finish this group up. We'll talk about those that live on cliff tops, riparian zones, flat woods, and on escarpments. And then that'll lead us into savannas. On the following lecture, we're going to get into prairies next, various types of wetlands. And by that, my friends, we'll be down almost to the end of class. So we're going to get through them all, I think. But we're going to keep it at about the same pace. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, rattlesnake master. Oh, super cool plant, man. So rattlesnake master right here in the bottom. This is a plant that is now become exceedingly uncommon. It's probably rare. It is rare. It is a obligate host plant for the rattlesnake master borer moth, which is now almost to be listed as endangered by the U.S. Endangered Species Act because its host plant has disappeared. This plant is not only great for pollinators, but it's super finicky to restore because if you were to plant that seed, which we did at Dunbar Cave Prairie, it takes about 5 years for it to even come up in a restored prairie. So it's a very finicky species. And then culturally, it's very important. Numerous cultural discoveries in caves of this region have found where Native Americans used its leaves, which are very fibrous, to weave sandals. So between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago, rattlesnake masters were probably the main plant being used to make sandals for Native Americans.